This talk and the JavaScript for WordPress conference are brought to you by our sponsors at 10up and WP Buffs. 10up makes a better web with finely crafted websites and tools for content creators. Check out their junior and senior dev positions at 10up.com/careers. WP Buffs provides 24/7 fully managed support and white label agency services. Find out how they can help you focus on what you do best at wpbuffs.com/partnerships.
The talk I'm going to be doing today is the benefits of testing and automation. So I recorded the intro video with Zach months ago, and we were talking about all kinds of different things we can do. But really, what I do every day is I'm a developer programs engineer at Pantheon on our developer advocate team. So I go in and I help our clients with complex problems and really focus on developer workflows and automated testing and lots of this good stuff. So I wanted to share that and kind of bring it in and relate it to JavaScript and go over some of the benefits I've seen people get when they adopt automation, the benefits I've seen by adopting automation, and sort of what that process looks like. I'm A. Taylor ME on GitHub and Twitter. I posted the link for the slides into the JavaScript for WordPress Slack channel. So if you want to get those, go ahead and grab them. Or if you have any questions, I'll be staying on after the talk to answer those in Slack. Or you can send me an email, andrew@pantheon.io. Cool, so let's get started. Thinking about how I could really relate this to JavaScript, I actually went through a few iterations of the example I wanted to run through in this talk, and finally ended up forking Wes Boss's React for Beginners course. It's what I went through when I was first kind of cutting my teeth and learning React, and I emailed Wes and he was nice enough to let me use it. So I took the catch of the day code repository in the app, which we'll look at here in a second. I forked it, and then we're going to look at how to add some testing to this. This is actually an example that a lot of you might already be familiar with, and we're just going to look at playing around with that. So one thing I did notice after I built this app and took the course is that the user experience for inputting the price is not the best. So I actually have the app up here, and we can see that this price for halibut is $17.24, and that the app assumes that it's in cents. But if someone else is managing your store, and let's say they are used to putting in dollars and there's a decimal, and they save this without knowing that it needs to be in cents, well, now we come in and we see that our price over here, since it thinks the 17.24 cents, it converts that down. Instead of $17.24, we now have our halibut priced at 17 cents, and the order total went from like 80 to 30, and maybe now we're selling fish at a wrong price. Or someone has that decimal point in there, and then we add a dollar sign, and now I get nan, not a number, right? And that's something, if working with JavaScript, we've probably all seen, the not a number. So this is something that I wanted to fix, right? And make it so that you could input with a dollar sign and decimal if you want, or you could, we have all these existing fish that are already in cents. I still wanted those to work. So how do we get the best of both? And let's walk through that. So looking at the code base, there was this order.js, and we can see in here that we're just getting fish.price, which is the price for each fish, and we're just using that as is and showing it and displaying it. So that's, maybe we should sanitize that a little bit, clean up that data, make sure it's in the format we expect. And the same thing here, there's this helpers.js with this format price function that assumes cents is the input coming in, divides it by 100, and then converts it so that it has the dollar sign in correct decimal places. But I don't know, that user input, we can't always assume it's going to be cents, and dividing by 100 when we have the dollar sign in there and stuff, and it's a string, that's where we get the nan coming in. And we see those not a number errors and all kinds of stuff. So this is really an assumption that's being made that we don't want to make that assumption. So I wanted to add a test to test that this will work the way I expect. And the way I expect is being able to add the $, add a decimal for the input, and go in and have the user either enter cents or dollars with the decimal and get the price working the way we want. And this app, if you're not familiar with it, was built with Create React app, excuse me. And it's a nice tool that goes in and scaffolds a React project for you. And it actually has documentation on testing already. So go read the docs. You know, this is Create React app. It uses Jest. It's a good sort of testing interface there. If you're not familiar with it, please read the docs. We're not going to dive in on how to do tests. We're going to look at lots of examples in this talk of the different types of tests and the things you can do and really focus in on the benefits. But you just have to choose what testing framework is right for you. There's a lot of them out there. If you're working with React, Jest is really good, goes along nicely with Create React app. So that's what we're using here. And if you're not familiar with test-driven development, the idea is that we want to write our test first for the problem we're trying to solve, and then go back and refactor our code until the test passes. So here, I'm going to add a test that the formatted price is what we expect. So I'm importing my format price function from helpers. I'm testing that it returns a properly formatted price. I have this array of arrays, this price list, and basically on the left, we have what the input will be, and on the right, I have what I expect the output is going to be of the formatted price. And so here, we can see that we have, oh man, just lost my monitor here for a second. All kinds of technical difficulties today. Here we go. So we can see here on the left that we have just standard cents that was expected to be input before. We're going to do this refactoring. That comes out as it should. I want to test a large number, so we get multiple commas in there. And here I have 2 decimal places. Kind of weird, but maybe someone does it accidentally. We're going to test that that gets formatted properly. We have a negative number with a decimal. And then finally, I have a string with a whole bunch of garbage and weird characters in here. And no matter what the user puts in, I want to make sure that I'm still getting a properly formatted price on the output. And so down here, we're just looping through these with a for each loop, all the items in our price list. And then we're taking the first item, which is our input here, we're running it through format price. And then we have this .tobe method. So we expect format price on this first value to be format price in the second value. So that's a pretty simple test, kind of good intro to see what those look like and how you can write tests for JavaScript. If you've ever done unit tests in PHP, this is very similar. We just found an error, something we want to fix, wrote a test for it. And now if we run the test fails. It comes back and it expected this $, commas, all these nice things, and it comes back with nan, which is exactly what we saw when we were testing this ourselves doing manual QA. But now instead of every time I refactor and change something, having to fire up the app and go in there and input all these different things and make sure they validate, it's being tested. I just run the test and it happens for me. So we're already saving a little bit of time and effort and kind of the tedious task of going back and doing that every single time we save code. Well, now we can do it with our test suite. And so to refactor that code, I just went in and added another function to the helpers file called 2cents It's going to take a user input, sanitize it, and return the number in cents. So first we grab it, convert it to a string, then use some regular expressions. We get rid of everything that's not a digit or the dash, because we want to be able to have our negatives in there. And then we turn that back into a number and return it. So whether we have a string or a number coming in, we're always going to get a number coming back out too. And then we go ahead and use it inside of our helper, our format price helper. So we come in, if our input's null, we're just going to return nothing. Otherwise, we're going to take a new variable called cents, and we're going to set that to the user input. So rather than taking the user input directly and dividing it by 100, we're going to run it through our 2 cents helper here. So we can go in, make sure it's actually cents before we divide by 100, and then convert it to our string. And I'm using this in order.js as well. This is where it's calculating totals. That's where we got if the input was off. We had the decimal in there. It was showing us 17 cents instead of $17 for the price of the fish. But now we're wrapping that fish price in 2 cents. So we're making sure that we're actually getting cents and our calculations are going to come out correctly. And then run the test again, and it passes, which is great. Because if the test passed, now I don't have to go back and do that QA. I know things are going to work well. I'll show you guys just for demonstration purposes, actually. So check out my branch with the fixes here, and then come in, look at our app, and we have 1724 is showing up here when we input cents. But now if I add a decimal and a $sign, it stays with what we expect here. Which is pretty cool. So now we can go in some weird characters and things, and it's still, we're sanitizing that user input. And just to be safe, the 2 cents helper that we wrote, the new function we created, just added a test for that as well. So rather than test just the final output of the formatted price, I also want to test that this is doing what I expect it to be doing. And because I'm making use of this function also when we're calculating the total. So if this function's broken, my total calculation is going to be broken, not just the display. So I want to go in and test this as well. It's very, very similar to how the other test was set up. We just have on the left our input coming in, and on the right, the cents coming out. So we can see everything gets stripped out there and turned into cents. Cool. And then the next thing I did was set up the test to run automatically with CI. And so you might be wondering, well, what is CI? It stands for continuous integration. So basically, CI is a process that runs in the cloud somewhere. You can usually define a server environment. So whether you need Node or PHP or different things, in this case, Jest needs Node, we can set that up. We can have that ready to go. And then we can write scripts that are going to take care of tasks for us. So continuous integration is just a service or a place in the cloud that you can run your automated tests and your automated processes. So we're going to really talk about some of the benefits of this automation, but going in and knowing that continuous integration is there, and it's what's going to allow us to automate these things and move them in the cloud and happen automatically. So every time we commit to GitHub or make a pull request, you can have some that run on cron. For example, I have some that go in and run like every hour and check for WordPress updates to not just core, but also plugins and themes. Apply updates, do some testing. We can take a look at that example at the end if we have some time, but I know we started a little bit late. And I really want to explain this idea that CI is a state of mind. So you're not just, okay, I wrote some tests, I need to automate that. There's lots of things you can automate in your workflow. And so, like, what do you do after a code change? And this is really what I work with a lot of teams on, is figuring out where they can automate, improve their workflow and their process, get some of these advantages. And it's hard to know where to start because there's so many different things you can automate, but take a look at what you're already doing. So what happens after a code change? Usually as a developer, you're not just writing code and committing it, you're doing lots of other things. So you might be installing dependencies. Is that something that has to be done in order to work with your code? That might be a barrier to entry for junior devs, or all of us working in open source, somebody contributing to your project if they have to download all these different pieces of software or dependencies. Building source files into production files. Deployments, right? So going out and actually deploying from your local to a staging server, or from a staging or a test server to production. Those are all things that are eating up your time. Communication. After you update something, do you notify members of your team? Do you notify other folks of what's happening with the project, that, hey, this server is up there, you can go take a look at the link? That's something we can automate. And that testing in QA. So we just looked at a great example of before. I had to go in and manually fire up the app locally, go in and test that the price input as I was refactoring is what I expected. And if I want to make sure that continues to work as expected in the future, then I'm gonna have to do that piece of QA every single time I make any code change. And it might not seem like much, that, you know, I can do it in a minute, but if you save a minute on every single code change, that adds up to be quite a bit over time. And then configuration is another example I've seen people automate around, where if you're going from one environment to the other, maybe you need to update some configuration. So if we're deploying, you know, from our staging environment to our production environment, maybe the credentials need to change. So if we're working with a store or some e-commerce, we need to go from a test gateway to a live gateway, payment gateway. And maybe we're updating that API token, or we're turning on some other items. So this is a workflow that I've diagrammed out that has really helped teams. It's something I've adopted, and it's worked well for a lot of others that you might consider. And it just shows you visually a little bit where CI fits in. So if we have our custom code on version control, you know, GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, whatever you want to do, and we just have the code we're working on there. So working with JavaScript, I don't have node modules, right? We don't want to commit that. If we're working with WordPress, then maybe I'm downloading WordPress core and plugins and themes with Composer. If you've ever worked with projects that do that, right? We have our SAS files, but not our production CSS, those sorts of things, right? With JavaScript, maybe we're writing ES6 syntax and that has to get transpiled with Babel back down. Great Webpack talk earlier. You don't want all of that production stuff and all of those dependencies that you need to get there checked into your version control. But the CI server can do all of that stuff. So rather than having to do that locally, CI server can download all of those dependencies, compile assets, all of those things, but then take it a step farther. Now that you have your site artifact fully built out, why not spin up a staging environment and deploy the code out there? And then when that's done, the CI server can go back, run some automated testing, do some reporting and analytics. If everything looks good with all of the tests, maybe we even pause here for some human QA and intervention, and we do things like approve the pull request and merge it into master. Well, then the CI server can handle that deployment to production as well. So we don't forget to do anything. Especially we talked, a little bit about switching that payment token up to the live item for production, right? The live API token. So those are all things that the CI server can take care of because we're humans, we make errors. And so the more of this process you can automate, the less you rely on people. And especially when I'm working with teams thinking about, oh, there's someone on our team that every time we deploy, they handle switching the API keys, or we have a script for that. What happens if that person is out sick or somebody else has to do it? What happens if they forget? We're all humans, we make errors, right? We put it in a script, we're not going to forget. Did you forget to run the script? There's all kinds of places where it can break down, but moving to continuous integration and automating is going to take away all of that uncertainty. And that gives you a lot of consistency, right? So if you've ever forgotten to check that one thing, before we were talking about changing configuration, but if you've ever forgot to QA that one thing, what's the item that if it goes down, the client's going to call you at 2 a.m.? That might be a donation form for a nonprofit, checkout for an e-commerce, all sorts of things. We want to automate that so that we don't have to worry about it and reduce that human error. And we get that consistency taking advantage of CI. So I use Circle CI. There's lots of alternatives out there. Use whatever makes the most sense for you and your team. Look at features, look at pricing, all of that stuff, and make a decision. But this is just an example. It's a YAML configuration file. Most of them use YAML. Pretty standard practice here, but I'm just defining jobs and what I want run. And in this example, there's actually some bash scripts and different commands that are going to fire off as well, but I'm defining this workflow of all of these jobs, and then they run every single time. So here I have a visual regression testing job. I have code sniffing. That's going to run every time. Even if the developer who's working locally forgets to check against WordPress coding standards, our CI server can check, and we can block the merge of that pull request if that test fails, right? So eliminating that human factor and making sure things happen consistently. You also get reduced overhead. If we look at this, this is a lot of work. If you have somebody on your team or people on your team doing all of this manually, it's a ton of work. Think back to the days when you had to provision servers manually, right? Now we have things like auto scaling and all of these items. Docker, you can like one-click spin up environments with a lot of hosts. Well, I think back to the days when you had to open an IT ticket and someone had to actually go like spin up a physical machine for you. And now that those things are automated, those people can spend their time doing other items. And so reducing that overhead, if you're doing all of this stuff or even part of this stuff on your team, know that you can automate almost everything in this diagram. And so you spend less time doing that and more time developing, which is great. So it's really, really important that you understand what you can automate, and that reduced overhead is where you're going to save billable hours, because you can't really bill a client for setting up Webpack or training a junior dev to use whatever tool you've chosen, right? That's tough stuff to see as a line item. So here I have an example. I created a pull request, want to change the sidebar background from gray to green. My CI server ran it, automatically spun up a new environment, and then posted a link back to GitHub. You can interact with other pieces in your tool chain as long as it has an API. You can communicate with it, which we're going to talk more about communication in a minute. Visual regression testing. This is really, really great because it helps you with that visual QA, right? And so going in, you can also do browser testing. You could call out to an API service like that. So imagine for every pull request, you spun up a new environment, built your production code, shipped it there, but then you called out to Browser Stack or something else, and IE's already been tested, and a report gets posted back to GitHub. That would save you a ton of time. Even if you're already using Browser Stack, you still have to remember to go there and log in. So by automating that, we're reducing that overhead, even if you're not doing the browser testing, of actually firing off the tests and remembering to do it. And now that you don't have to remember to do all these things, you've taken that burden off yourself. You can go in and focus on other work and what is actually important for you to be spending time on. We also mitigate risk. We've all been involved in a situation where it worked on my local machine. Well, if we're automating these QA tasks and we're doing it and we're spinning up environments that match what we're going to have in production, and we really have this workflow dialed in, then you're not going to have that scenario. Things might work locally, but when you push up and the continuous integration server runs all of your tests, a test will fail. And you can catch that stuff. You can also, if you're doing this automated QA, you can go in and catch items before they ever hit production. So here I'm compiling gulp assets. And I've seen it where if you're just working locally, and this is maybe you commit the compiled CSS to your repository or the compiled JS or whatever. Well, specifically with Sass, I've seen people have different versions of Sass installed on their local machine, and the files compile different, even if you're using a tool like Gulp or Grunt or something. Here is an example of a Lighthouse report. This is a really great test to run and something that you can automate with every pull request, whether you're working with JavaScript or WordPress. Basically, it does an audit for performance, accessibility, SEO, all kinds of best practices, and it gives you a report. The nice thing about Lighthouse is it can format this HTML report, but it can also output in JSON, which we can then read on our CI server and determine like, hey, is this code that's being introduced going to make performance drop? Is it going to hurt SEO? Those are things we can test for before it ever ships, rather than having the client or somebody else notice and tell us that, hey, performance is down, or our SEO rankings tanked. What did you guys do? And now we have to roll back and things. So catching all that stuff early, making sure we test for it every single time, having that consistency, mitigating that risk. It gives you confidence. If you have a robust test suite and all of your tests pass, then here's some examples of test passing. Here's our fish test from the beginning passing after we fixed items. It gives you confidence that you're not shipping bugs. It gives your team confidence that other people are introducing bugs. Or if I've written this test and somebody else submits a pull request for some different piece of code and this test still passed, I have confidence that nobody's broken this pricing issue that I've already fixed. And maybe they don't even know to test for it. Someone comes in and works on the code and they don't know that I fixed this bug, weeks or months or however long ago, but it's still being tested for. Gives you that high confidence. And especially if your stuff, I'm guessing clients have access, right? Maybe you're working on their GitHub, or they can see what's going on with issues and pull requests and all of that. If you have it set up properly with the CI server, this actually shows up in GitHub on every pull request. And it'll come in, and when all of these checks are green, and then you're a freelancer doing work for someone, you're contributing to an open source project, and all of these things are green, it gives you confidence that the code you're introducing is not going to break anything. And the last benefit we'll cover is communication. So communication, this is something that teams, I talk to them about automating communication. They're like, what are you talking about? The things we've touched on previously, so going in and automating parts of your QA process, automating deployments, downloading dependencies, compiling production assets, all of those things are pretty obvious, but communication is not one that's usually obvious to people, and it's something that can save you a lot of time and headache. So here's an example, like Slack has an API. We can go in and post the results of our tests with links and just have a running channel for your project that project managers can keep an eye on, so they don't have to go bug developers. I've actually, the coolest thing I saw someone do with communication and advancing that is that every time they deployed code to production, they cut a release and shipped. They would do that with Git tags, and they would go in on their CI server and actually look at the history between that Git tag and the last one, go through all of those commits, and if those commits had Jira ticket numbers in them, they called out to the Jira API and closed those tickets because they're now in production. That seems like, oh, that's cool. But to break it down for you, what they were experiencing previously is they had a 2-week sprint and release cycle. So project managers were hunting down developers after every release and trying to figure out if what they were advocating for, what they want, their clients wanted to see, what they were in charge of seeing go out for this release, if it got done or if it got pushed, the status of the stuff they were monitoring. And so they would have to go either bug these developers. And if I'm a developer and a project manager sends me a message that says, hey, do you know if this thing made it? It might be something I worked on, but if I have to go back and look at, maybe I didn't cut the release. I might know if that branch is merged or if it's something someone else worked on, and I have to go back and look at 2 weeks of Git commit history by myself. That's a pain. Or, even if I know what got released and doesn't, and I have to go back into Jira and update every single ticket that I worked on for the last 2 weeks with the status, that takes time. That's where you're saving those things that aren't necessarily billable hours. And now that's being automated so that when a release goes out, I know those tickets are getting closed. I don't have to worry about it. I can take that time I've saved and go work on billable hours and items that can have a positive impact. And this is an example of, I ran a Lighthouse test and performance failed. And so post that result back to GitHub. So right here in the PR, we have a link to it, a link to the test if we want to go view the full thing, but a nice quick summary of the results. And so I don't even have to go in and view the results of the report because it's already been parsed and it's telling me that the score of 37 is less than the acceptable score of 81. So now I can continue to refactor my code until performance gets above that threshold. And I kind of want to, before we start wrapping up here, just remind you that automation is a journey. So there's lots and lots of different testing tools. We've looked at like visual regression, Lighthouse. You can write Jest for kind of JavaScript level unit testing. Maybe you've already worked with unit testing in WordPress. There's BHAT, all sorts of things. Just remember it's a journey. Pretty frequently, I see teams try and go from 0 to 100, and we're going to implement automation in CI, and yeah, let's go for it. But don't try and do it all at once. You're not going to sit down in like one session or a weekend or something and automate your entire process and get to the point of kind of that diagram we showed. That's something that took me about a year of refining this process and this automation to get to that point. And I do things like merge a commit and then performance goes down. Okay, let's add a Lighthouse test to check for performance, because now that's something we know that we've caught this issue that we want to be testing for every time. Or if you're going in, just really be honest. How much QA are you really doing? Are you going in and for an e-commerce site, on every single commit that you guys push, are you going in, spinning up an environment, hooking up a dummy checkout process, adding items to cart, going through the entire process and making sure it was successful? If the answer is yes, you're spending a lot of human hours on that, then go in and spend the time to automate it so you can save those human hours, and then use the time you save to automate other pieces of your process that are causing pain and taking time from the folks on your team. With visual regression testing, be honest, and do you go in and look at the homepage and a few templates, and if things look good, that's the QA you do. If that's all you do, then automate just that. You don't need to go and get 100% code coverage and add all sorts of other testing. Automate what you're actually spending time on now, and then go back and add that other stuff later. You don't have to do it all in one go. So it is definitely an upfront time investment. So identify the areas that you're spending time that you'll save time on, and justify spending that time up front to get those long-term benefits. Don't go and just add new pieces of QA that you're not already doing and spend time on automating those, because it's not time that you're going to be saving if you're not doing those things already. And I have some resources here at the end. So I have my example repository, which we can go over and take a look at. I actually opened a pull request just to kind of show you guys. And this one, I deliberately broke the test. So we looked at some of those files we were talking about at the beginning. In here, rather than dividing my formatted cents by 100, I just went back to what the app was doing originally and taking the user input as is, and my tests are failing. So this is nice here. If you guys want to look at the code and see what's going on, you can download this app. You can run it yourself. The one thing that is really nice about automating this is it lowers the barrier of entry to work on your project. So if someone else wanted to work on this, they would have to clone the repository, run npm install, get all the dependencies, go edit some files. They would have to know that they need to run the tests. And even if I have like a contributors doc or something that says, please run these tests, that's not a guarantee everyone's going to do it. By automating that, I can make sure it happens every time, but also take it off their plate and make contributing much easier. So if you run an open source project, think about automating, because people contributing to your project, or if you're doing a project for work or something like that, and you bring on a contractor, what is that barrier to entry like for them to contribute? What's the barrier to entry for a junior dev that you just hired and you need to get trained up? Do they have to learn about Jest and Webpack and all of these, in your deployment pipeline? Or can they just come in and start making changes? So in this case, if I go look at files changed, here's how low the barrier to entry for contribution is now that I'm automating my tests. I can come back in and we can see that instead of input here, I'm going to make this cents again. So we're using our formatted cents. And then I'm going to come in and change this. Now, hopefully tests will pass, right? And that's it. I didn't have to download it, clone the repo. I didn't have to go in and run tests automatically, run tests locally, excuse me. That stuff's going to be run automatically. And if we go over and take a look, Circle CI is watching. I've defined the workflow in here. So we're also doing some linting. That's going to happen. So it's going to download node modules, and then it's going to come in and run the test, which is pretty cool. So that's a really, really low barrier to entry. If someone can just come and click edit on GitHub and submit a PR, right? So a few other examples in here. I have an advanced WordPress example, that diagram we showed that has dependencies downloading with Composer, compiling production assets, testing, deployment, the whole shebang. This is an example of that. So if this is not JavaScript specific, there are some JavaScript pieces using gulp and some things in here to help build assets, but mostly this is a WordPress example. But if you want to look at the whole shebang, then you can come in here and take a look at the Circle CI config and some of the scripts in here. Cool, so that's all I have. Thanks for watching. I'm glad we were able to squeeze this in even with those technical difficulties. So the slides are actually, I think that's an incorrect link. I'll make sure that gets updated. I'll post the link to the slides again, and then I will hang around Slack and answer some questions.
Thanks for watching this talk from the JavaScript for WordPress conference. If you're interested in more talks like this, head over to javascriptforwp.com/conference to see an archive of all talks, as well as information about upcoming events.